Continuing with the calendar, House Bill 766, a bill to amend and reenact section of the Code of Virginia relating to carrying concealed handguns, protective orders. Report from the Committee on Militia Police and Public Safety with an amendment.
The gentleman from Shenandoah, Mr. Gilbert.
Move the committee amendment, Mr. Speaker.
On adoption of the committee amendment, as many as favor of that motion will say aye. Those opposed, no. The amendment is agreed to. The gentleman from Shenandoah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of the House, as you may be aware by now, we in the Republican caucus here in the House had a fairly aggressive domestic violence package that we rolled out at the beginning of this session. This package increases penalties on certain types of domestic violence. It lowers the threshold by which repeat offenders become felons in a number of cases. It expands the list of prohibited conduct in the area of domestic violence. As you know, the domestic violence was a significant part of our landmark agreement on firearms last week. We have come a long way on the topic of domestic violence, but we can always do more. And this bill, Mr. Speaker, gives an added tool to people who find themselves truly in crisis, people who are victims, people who have nowhere to turn, folks who want to maybe have the opportunity to take control of their own personal defense to protect themselves and their children. This tool will effectively allow people not to have to stand in line when they choose to undertake their own personal protection and at a time when they're the most vulnerable. And what it does is create the opportunity for a victim who gets a protective order to immediately have the right to carry concealed, again, to choose to, in most cases, women in this instance, to choose to protect herself as she sees fit without having to wait in that line, Mr. Speaker. So we give her 45 days to apply to get a permit at the circuit court. Once you apply for your permit at the circuit court, it gives you another 45 days, which is the statutory period by which, is the statutory period for which the court is required to act on a domestic violence, on a concealed carry permit. And it also puts that person at the top of the line when they do apply. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to answer any questions. And I think this is an important step forward in giving additional tools to victims, especially those who choose to protect themselves as they see fit, as I said. And there is one complementary bill that's headed this way, a bill that would provide funding for folks in these circumstances to be able to get training through an existing fund at DCJS. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Fairfax, Mr. Simon.
Mr. Speaker, will the gentleman yield for a question?
Gentleman yield.
I yield.
Gentleman yields.
Mr. Speaker, I would ask the gentleman, I understand that there's a companion bill on the way, but nothing in this bill, beyond just shortening the line, nothing in this bill requires that someone wanting to use their protective order as a concealed carry permit receive any kind of training, demonstrate any kind of competency with the handgun, any familiarity with the handgun, or any other dangerous weapon. Is that right?
Mr. Speaker, I responded to the gentleman by saying, yes, that is absolutely correct. And there are those of us on this side of the aisle who philosophically don't believe that you should have to get your government's permission to be able to protect yourself in any manner you see fit, or to protect your children for that matter. So this recognizes that there are instances, and I know the gentleman probably agrees with me about the gravity of the issue of domestic violence. I know he has sat in committees where we've discussed this and how best to protect people who find themselves in crisis, who find themselves fearful of a husband, a wife, a domestic partner, whatever it may be, who find themselves legitimately scared to the point where a judge or magistrate is willing to give them a protective order because they are in fear for their life. And I know the gentleman and I have the same goal of protecting those people, and I know that he may differ in this regard, but certainly I don't believe that a woman in crisis should have to go stand in line as the gentleman would suggest she should have to in order to avail herself of her God-given right of self-protection. The bill does contemplate, Mr. Speaker, that eventually, in very short order, that person, that woman, go put herself through the standard practice that we require of all citizens to get the requisite training, to file the application, to pay the fees, whatever it may be. But we can't worry about that at that instant where she has determined and a court has determined that she is potentially in danger. And so this bill seeks to protect her, the training element notwithstanding.
Speaker, would the gentleman yield for an additional question?
Will the gentleman yield?
I yield.
Gentleman yields.
Mr. Speaker, I would ask the gentleman, this bill refers to a number of different kinds of protective orders, and the gentleman referenced the deal that we've got on domestic violence and taking guns out of a household under certain kinds of protective orders. I think it's only permanent protective orders that are issued, after a hearing and so forth. This bill would apply, if I'm reading it correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, I believe you'd agree this applies to all kinds of protective orders. Is that right? Even emergency and so forth?
The gentleman is correct.
Mr. Speaker, will the gentleman yield for an additional question?
Will the gentleman yield?
I yield.
Gentleman yields.
Mr. Speaker, the gentleman spoke of the need for women to be able to avail themselves of their right to self-protection, and I believe that the code section that this bill amends already authorizes, under current law, there's an exception for carrying a firearm, a shotgun, a rifle, a handgun, within the curtilage of your own home without a concealed carry permit. And I believe that under current law, someone fearing for their life could open carry a firearm. So it seems like this is fairly narrow in what it would do. What would this bill allow women to do that they can't currently do that's so important to their self-protection, Mr. Speaker?
Well, I would respond to the gentleman by saying it's fairly obvious, to me at least, what it does is it allows you to carry concealed without a permit. So I understand the gentleman doesn't like the concept generally, probably doesn't like the concept of gun ownership generally, probably doesn't like any of the concepts embodied in this bill or even the existing law. That said, I don't believe victims should be limited in their choice of how to protect themselves. Certainly somebody in that circumstance should not be required to open carry. Certainly a woman who finds herself in peril like this should not have to lug a shotgun with her to the grocery store where she may encounter her husband who's told her he's going to kill her. This gives her the ability to be discreet about the manner in which she chooses to protect herself, Mr. Speaker.
Speaker, speaking to the bill at the appropriate time.
Gentleman has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, members of the House, it sounds to me like what this bill is really limited to do is to take someone who, as the gentleman from Shenandoah points out, is in crisis. Someone who's fearful, someone who's scared, someone who's frightened, someone who's just sought an emergency protective order, and give them the permission, whether they've any training, any familiarity with how to use a weapon or not, give them permission to stick a handgun in their purse and take it with them and their children to a grocery store, to the Walmart, or wherever they need to go, again, without any regard to their competency to handle that firearm. And so I do share the gentleman's, I think, very sincerely held concern for victims of domestic violence and for women and children, folks that find themselves in that situation. Unfortunately, I find that this legislation is likely to make those people less safe. The facts are that when a firearm is present in a domestic violence situation, the likelihood of a murder or fatality goes up 500 times. When you put people in again, they're scared, that are frightened, that might really think it's a good idea to handle a firearm they're not familiar with, have them put that in their purse without knowing how to safely handle it, how to put a safety on, how to keep it out of the reach of their 3- and 4-year-old children who would be there in the shopping cart with them and with that firearm. I just believe that makes those people more vulnerable. It makes them less safe. I think it's the wrong approach. I think a much better approach, an approach that hopefully we can all agree on, is to take weapons out of those situations. When we have somebody who needs a protective order, when we have somebody who finds themselves in a domestic violence situation, I don't think we ought to wait for a permanent protective order. I think we ought to take steps to immediately remove all the firearms from that situation. I think that makes women and children of this Commonwealth and their families safer. And I would urge the body not to vote to engross this bill and pass it on to its third reading.
The gentleman from Albemarle, Mr. Bell.
Speaker Rice, speak the bill.
The gentleman has the floor.
So I want to just sort of respond to what the gentleman just said. So I hear a lot of I think, but the important translation here is I will decide for you what's best for you. Now, we sit in this body, which is we have armed guards, we've got metal detectors, the governor has his security detail, but particularly in our smaller and rural jurisdictions, it is a long time to wait when you call 911. And all this bill would do would be to say that if you choose, nobody's making anybody get a gun. Nobody says that if you feel uncomfortable, you shouldn't do it. But if you are the victim and you choose and you think and you decide, this is an empowerment bill for the victims. I hope you'll pass the bill. Thank you.
The gentleman from Charlottesville, Mr. Toscano.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the gentleman from Shenandoah rise for a question?
I yield.
The gentleman yields.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd ask the gentleman, this is for my own edification, because we've had a lot of discussion over the years in courts about protective orders. And for those of you who are not aware, there are lots of different types of protective orders. There are preliminary protective orders, there are emergency protective orders, They're protective orders that last for a specified period of time. This bill references preliminary and emergency protective orders and allows somebody who has gotten one to get a concealed weapons permit, as I think the gentleman said, ahead of the line. So my question for the gentleman is, I don't understand why it is that we're saying that the emergency is sufficient enough in this case to allow somebody to get a concealed weapon, but in the other case where we're taking the guns away and you've got a judicial determination, why it's not the case that we don't take the guns away with the preliminary or the emergency. After all, they are emergencies and you need that protection right away.
Mr. Speaker, I would respond to the gentleman using the logic that we've used year in, year out on this issue. And I think the gentleman and those who maybe possess the same belief system on this issue, what they tend to believe is that if you magically pass a law, that will somehow lead to someone else's safety. And I would submit that although there are limited instances where it may help, including what's part of our domestic violence and gun-related package from last week, for the most part, if someone is bent on murdering those who they purport to love, if they are willing to kill their wife, their children, risk being executed at the hands of the state for those acts, if they are willing to do any of those things, there's very little that somebody can do that will prevent that if they are bent on doing it. What the gentleman thinks is that we can stop that kind of activity by passing a law. And frankly, Mr. Speaker, what I think this debate about this particular bill has revealed, that the folks on the other side of the aisle, most of them, they talk about wanting to disarm those convicted of domestic violence, people who are represent a risk to potential victims. They talk about doing that all the time. But what this bill has revealed is that they care much more about the gun issue than they do the smokescreen of domestic violence. They care much more about disarming domestic violence offenders and victims than they do protecting victims, in my opinion. This bill gives victims power. A protective order is a piece of paper. It doesn't stop bullets. Someone bent on killing their loved ones is not going to be stopped except anything by something that levels the playing field, and the police can't be everywhere all the time. The gentleman cited a statistic, which I'm sure comes from a very anti-gun group. I'm sure that statistic does not take into account what might happen if we did level that playing field and did empower victims and did provide the kind of training that's embodied in my House Bill 768, which is coming to the floor, which allows them to access an existing domestic violence fund to learn how to use a weapon properly and safely and efficiently in a way that will protect them and their family should the need arise. So I'd respond to the gentleman in that way, that while I understand him trying to create a difference, really the difference is that in this instance, this is going to do something. Telling somebody they can't have a gun who's bent on murder, I don't know is going to do anything if they're truly bent on murder. Having someone protect themselves in that instance is actually going to have an effect, and the desired effect, which is to stop the threat.
Mr. Speaker, speaking to the bill.
At the appropriate time. Gentleman from Virginia Beach, Mr. Davis.
Mr. Speaker, speaking to the bill.
Gentleman has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can appreciate the safety concerns from the gentleman from Fairfax, but I think he's missing the point of the bill. This doesn't prevent someone from getting a firearm or allow them to get a firearm. That's got nothing to do with this. They can have already owned the firearm. All this does is say that someone who's under this protective order is allowed to conceal that firearm. Now, if we want to talk about safety for a second, if a woman is scared for her life or her family's life, what's safer, for her to walk around open carrying a firearm where the assailant, who's maybe bent on harming her, can see the firearm and immobilize it or take it from them, or having her concealed in her purse where if she needs to use it, she can get to it without someone getting the jump on her? So, Mr. Speaker, I can appreciate some of the comments, but this isn't about whether someone should be allowed to carry or not allowed to carry. This should be whether they're allowed to carry concealed, and I think for safety reasons, that makes all the sense in the world.
The gentleman from Campbell, Mr. Ferris.
Mr. Speaker, I move the pending question.
The gentleman Campbell, Mr. Ferris, moves the pending question. As many in favor of that motion will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Pending question is called. Shall the bill be engrossed and passed to its third reading? As many in favor of that motion will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. Bill is engrossed and passed to its third reading.